I've ever served had a clock in the sanctuary until now. It was where the pastor could see it. The organist knew what time and when to start worship, and the pastor knew where the clock was when it should end. Now, time in worship is a Caucasian concern. African American churches do not usually care about time. They know when it's to start, and it ends when it's done. And whatever that is, only somebody else knows. I'm concerned about the clock, and I try to stay within the hour, except on communion Sundays. I'll just gave myself out. Because I grew up, or in my youth, we had a minister that did not know what that marble thing in the back of the sanctuary was, and didn't seem to care. But he did not have to go home and listen to my mother talk about her dried up dinner. There's a story told about a preacher who was well known for his hour-long worship services. And one Sunday he talked and talked and talked, and people were getting itchy and agitated, and they went out for about a half an hour beyond their usual time. Well, after the service, the deacons approached him and said, "What happened?" He said, "Well, for years I've always put a candied mint in my mouth when I started, and when it was gone, I knew it was over. But this week, I kept going and going and realized that I'd put a button in my mouth." Now, preachers are not the only ones who have to keep track of time. All of us have deadlines. We want to be here on time. If we're going to travel, we have planes to catch. We're worried about when we put the dinner in the oven. We want to make sure it doesn't stay in too long. We're getting close to tax season, so papers have to be filed on time. Orders have to be filled. Calendars and smartwatches have become our masters. In the book Time Wars, the author writes about the notion of time not being measured until it was the Benedictine monks, who had a passion for organizing and filling every minute of the day with something useful. They thought that idleness was the enemy of the soul. In the 15th century, clock towers became as important as bell towers, and it was not until the 17th century that second hands were added to their clocks. Now, I agree with the Benedictines to a certain extent, but life is much more better when it is organized. We can think in terms of plans for weeks and days and months, and even for minutes and for hours. But I know that I lose something. I may pay more attention to my organization than instead of listening to the natural rhythm in my mind. And unfortunately, as we get more busy, where we pay attention more to our toys and our gadgets and whatever else is going on in our lives, we're also moving from the fact of an understanding that each moment is a gift from a gracious God. Instead of just something that we don't care what happens, that we're always going to have it. And for some people, we take it for granted until we no longer have it. Now, this morning's reading was a very familiar one. It's been turned into songs and whatever, and I gave you the very short version. For everything, there is a season under heaven. In Hebrew, this book is known as Queloth, the man who wrote it. In Greek, he's Ecclesiastes. And in English, we call him the preacher. Now some scholars, trying to fill in the blanks, have thought that maybe King Solomon wrote this at the end of his life and was looking back and realized what it was like to have 300 wives and 700 girlfriends. Now the author of this book, whoever it was, whenever they wrote it, understood life differently than we understand it today. By the language and the references to other parts of it, it was written after the Babylonian exile, when the people of Israel had returned and were now living in Jerusalem again. During that time, the Hebrew people had learned the hard way that life was never the way they expected it to be or what they had been promised. And that they had also learned that it should never be taken for granted. Some people, probably more cynical than we want them to be, have called this author a cynic himself. I myself seeing him as an honest man who looks at life for what it is and calls it the way it is. As a people of faith, we know that there are ups and downs. We also lose some people of faith when there are too many downs and they only expected ups. People who move beyond that know that God doesn't just leave us in a bubble, that there are times when we are not protected from the boogeyman. Now, we're more familiar with the reading, but we know that it's written in the very, very, very familiar type of two answers, two phrases that go together, which is part of Hebrew poetry. It begins at square one. There's a time to be born and a time to die. A time to plant and a time to pluck up. A time to sow and a time to reap. Each one of us is going to live. We've already been born. And eventually, each one of us will die. Someone said that time is a great teacher. Unfortunately, time also kills all of its pupils. Mr. Queller would agree, but he would not use the word unfortunately. Life is. Things occur. The universe is moving. So live. Enjoy the gift as it is a present. These are facts. God knows reality. And each one of us will experience them in God's good time. So we ask ourselves at the end of this we hope never to experience again year, what time is it? There's a time to build and a time to break down. A time to be born and a time to die. Another person wrote, "For yesterday is but a memory, and tomorrow is a vision. But today well lived makes every yesterday a memory of happiness, and every tomorrow a vision of hope." When Jesus began his ministry after he came out of the wilderness with his time with the devil, he told people in his first sermon, "The time is fulfilled. The kingdom is in your midst." Each time we hear that, there is another now created. Now is the moment of our salvation. This year of the Lord that we're quickly approaching, 2021, is already filled with divine possibilities. The past is never completely finished or forgotten, but the new is already here. Are you ready to touch it? Jesus knew all this about time. He didn't know everything that was going to occur. He didn't know that he was going to die on Good Friday afternoon at 3 o'clock and all that. But he knew enough about God that the word had come, that it was time that life was going to be different. He knew that he could trust his life to him, and then that would be sufficient for him. There's a story told about a dialogue between a student and their teacher. And the student begins, "Where shall I look for enlightenment?" "Here." "When will it happen?" "It is happening right now." "Then why don't I experience it?" "Because you are not looking." "What should I look for?" "Nothing. Just look." "Look at what?" "At anything your eyes see." "But must I look in a special way?" "No, the ordinary way will do." "But I don't always want to look in the ordinary way." "No, you don't." "But why not?" "But to look, you have to be here. And you always seem to be somewhere else." There's a story told about a man who was in the hospital, and his wife faithfully visited him every day. One day he looked at her and said, "You've always been with me, Agnes, when I was in trouble. When I lost all that money with that business venture with your brother, you were there. When I fell off the roof, you were there. When I got lost in Miami and went down that one-way street, you were there. When our house burned down, you were there. When I lost my job, you were there." "Yes, dear, I've always been with you. Sweetheart, I've come to the conclusion that you're bad luck." Eventually all of you will. Some people will like that. Thank you. Okay. About 10 minutes later. Some people, to go back to the serious part of the story, always assume the worst. You can count on them to be the first to criticize and to say the negative word. You can find them in any business, school, family, even in a church. Today we are rapidly coming to the end of 2020. And a lot of people keep saying, "Oh, it's going to be better. I can't wait for 2021. It's going to be better." I hope so. It may be better. I hope it doesn't get any worse. But the thing that is going to be the same is that we will not be alone. That God is going to be with us. There will be some good news for some people. There will be some terrible news for some people. But most of the days are just going to be slowly, no news. But our lives are going to be influenced by our attitude. Our lives are going to be shaped by our faith in God. The writer of the book of Ecclesiastes, since we use the most familiar one, is that God has given us a sense of what it means to be a part of the future. And this is why I think each one of us, however our faith is, if we have some faith in God, that we can face 2021 with hope. As we've sung twice, several times this morning, that there is a hope in the future. As God has been there in the past and is in the present and in the future, as I chose the first hymn, the God who has been faithful in the past, not because everything we've ever asked for we get, but God has been there. He is going to be faithful in the future. When Moses was leading the people of Israel across the desert out of Egypt, it is recorded in the book of Exodus that a pillar of cloud went before them by day and a pillar of fire by night. We are told that no matter where those people went, the two pillars, day and night, never left them alone. God, through the prophet Isaiah, said, "Behold, I am about to do a new thing. Now it springs forth. Do you see it?" In Matthew, Jesus told the disciples before his ascension, "Lo, I am with you always, even to the end of time." The Apostle Paul wrote the book, the Philippian church, "One thing I am forgetting, of what lies behind me, and straining forth to see what lies ahead. And so I press on." And the prophet John in the book of Revelation recorded, "And the one who is seated on the throne said, 'See, I am making all things new.'" If we take our Bibles seriously, we know that the God who has been faithful in the past can be trusted to be faithful in the future. That doesn't mean that there are moments when our faith leaves us, or it breaks, or it leaves, and we feel as if the mountain, instead of making something new, has pushed us into the canyon. We're looking for air. We're looking for hope. But I think our faith can tell us that when God says, "No matter what, I will be with you. I am your God.
Amen.
You will never, ever be alone." For everything there is a season, and a time for every purpose under heaven. We can trust our future to the one who has been faithful in the past. So I ask the question, since I don't know, and there's no clock in this room, what time do you think it is for God's people? Amen.